There's a lot of very perplexing things in this world, like how humans pass on genetic information to their offspring from one generation to another. Why are some conditions and diseases are present in any specific bloodlines? How does the environment affect every single one of us? And up to what extent does it affect every single living organism on Earth? And in this case, why are some identical twins possessing the same DNA deliberately grew up to be two distinctly different individuals from their development physically and other facets of their personality? How do identical twins become two unique individuals? And what is the perpetual debate about nature versus nurture have to do with all of this? For a very long time, the scientific community is actually very perplexed with the idea that there are different factors that affect the growth and development of the different living organisms on Earth. They argued and debated that there is actually the presence of the concept of nature and nurture. Or basically, they are considering here these two particular facets on how they actually interact and affect the development of the different organisms. If we're going to focus first on the presence of the nature it is actually the different genetic information that are embedded in every single one of us. Every single living organisms on Earth are possessing cells, and these cells are containing the hereditary program that is necessary for the sustenance of every single one of them. And scientists are actually arguing that there is a possibility that the different things that are embedded in our genome, the ones that are present in our nature, are the ones that are responsible for the different things that is happening on us for our own survival. While other scientists are actually arguing the concept that the environment or the nurture can directly affect the growth and development of different organisms. Since the nurture, it is now the location in which these organisms are living, and at the same time the interactions between other organisms and even the abiotic components of the nurture can actually have a drastic effect on these different types of organisms, basically giving them the capacity to adapt and at the same time to have a certain type of knowledge with the environment in which they belong to. But if you're actually going to consider this, specifically on the latter part of the 20th century, a new emerging idea actually arrived. And this idea is actually considered as the combination of the nature and the nurture, which is known as the epigenetics. But before we dig into the concept and ideas that are actually present in epigenetics, let's have a short recap of the different things that is actually related with this particular concept since we are talking about genetics per se. Always remember that every single living organism on Earth are possessing cells. And since us humans, we are considered as eukaryotic cells, so we are possessing an organelle known as the nucleus. And inside our nucleus, so we can locate here our genetic information in the form of the DNA. Every single cell in our body are actually containing DNA. And if we're actually going to stretch at least a piece of this DNA that is present in any cells in our body, we can actually stretch it to a length of almost 2 meters or more than the height of a typical Filipino. If you're now going to consider the length of the DNA, which is technically very long, how come that this very long strand of genetic information is already present on our cells? Well, the answer lies within our nucleus. And if we are going to look closely on the structures and materials that are actually present in our nucleus, we can actually see here that the DNA, which is a double helical structure, it is actually coiled on the protein known as histones, which will now create a nucleosome. And both of these materials are very vital on our understanding when it comes to epigenetics, because epigenetics is simply the study of heritable changes in gene expression that do not involve the changes to the underlying DNA sequence. When it comes to epigenetics, we can actually infer here that the genes will remain the same, but the phenotype or the physical characteristics that will simply be manifested by the different organisms will not be the same. Why is that? Because in the concept of epigenetics, we are going to consider here the materials known as the epigenome. Epigenome, it is now the collection of chemical compounds that can tell the genome what to do. Or basically, if you're going to compare the genome with the epigenome, the genome is just like a hardware, while the epigenome, it is now the software. The epigenome will actually dictate what would be the different proteins that will be created by this particular genome, and because of the different things that will be dictated by the epigenome, different types of physical characteristics will be manifested by the certain type of organism. We can actually relate the concept of epigenetics with the central dogma of molecular genetics, specifically on the part of the mRNA splicing. If you can still recall, if there are actually different types of processes that are involved in the process of splicing, different types of amino acid compounds will simply be created. That is actually the same thing that will simply happen when it comes to the epigenome. The epigenome will actually determine what type of amino acids can be created right after the process of the central dogma of molecular genetics. But in the case of epigenome, it goes beyond the mRNA or the process of transcription and translation, but rather the epigenome is actually present on the DNA. The epigenome is actually possessing a certain type of relationship with the DNA itself, since there are actually different types of modifications that can simply be done on the DNA that can either permit the process of replication, transcription, and translation, and there are actually some possibilities that a part of that certain type of gene be silenced, or the process will simply be paused or stopped. When it comes to the different epigenetic markers that are actually present on the DNA, we're going to focus first on the DNA methylation. When it comes to DNA methylation, from the name itself, it is now actually the attachment of a methyl group towards the cytosine nitrogenous base. Please take note that the methyl group will always attach itself to the cytosine because the cytosine permits the attachment of the methyl group, and it actually hinders the attachment of other types of proteins and enzymes for the process of either DNA replication or even transcription to happen in this particular part of the DNA. If that part of the DNA is actually possessing a methyl group, DNA to mRNA transcription will not definitely occur, since there is not the presence of that methyl group, which will now hinder for the attachment of the enzymes that is necessary for the start of the transcription process. Now, the second one. The second type of epigenetic modification, it is now known as the histone modification, and you guessed it right, it involves the presence of the histone. Since the histone, it is actually the protein in which the DNA is coiled. It can actually dictate what part of the DNA can be read or can be silenced based on the different things, specifically the chemical tags that will simply be attached to it. These chemical tags can either loosen or tighten the coiling of that certain type of DNA strand on the histone. If the DNA is very tight on the histone, that DNA will now be inaccessible. So basically, that gene, that portion of the DNA will be silenced or it will be turned off. And if the chemical tags that are actually present on the histone permit the DNA to loosen its coil, that part of the DNA or that gene will be turned on, or it will be readily accessible for the transcription factors for it to create now the different processes involved in the central dogma of molecular genetics, in which that gene will be transcribed, then it will be spliced, and lastly, it will be translated. to create now the necessary proteins that is needed by that specific part of the cell. If you're actually going to consider here the different things that is happening when it comes to epigenetics and epigenetic modifications, this actually related with the concept of the mRNA splicing and even the concept of gene silencing, in which some parts of the genes will actually be silenced that will now create the specific proteins. The reason why there is a diverse number of cells that are present in our body, that the cells that are present in our skin are not the same as the cells that are actually present in our muscles and on our bones. Because of the presence of gene silencing, it can actually create now the different proteins that are necessary for the different cells that are needed on the different parts of our body. It is now actually related with the concept of differentiation, in which the different cells in our body will actually possess the same genetic information but different function. And their different functions are actually being determined by the different genes that will simply be turned on and turned off. So if you're actually going to relate this concept of epigenetics, we can actually consider the concept of epigenetics with its relationship with the nurture. We're actually considering here that the environment or the nurture can actually affect and influence our epigenetic tags that can either silence or permit the formation and the presence of the different proteins in our body. So, what are actually the different things that are present in our environment that can affect our epigenetic tags? The first one, it is pollution. Well, basically, whenever we are talking about pollution, it can actually cause different types of damages not only on our organs but also on our genetic materials. Some researchers actually establish a correlation and relationship between the presence of air pollution and how it actually affects the metal tags that are present on one's DNA. And it can actually be passed down from one generation to the next, just like the prevalence of asthma and even the presence of some neurodegenerative disorders. So basically, whenever we are talking about epigenetics, it doesn't actually affect only us, but also the next generation or even more generations to come. Since some of these epigenetic markers can be removed during our embryonic development and will be replaced with new ones, some of those epigenetic markers can actually be inherited or stay on the next generation. Other than pollution, even our diet and lifestyle can greatly affect the different epigenetic tags that are present on our DNA. Basically, whenever we are talking about the diet and lifestyle, the different food products that we consume have shown to modify epigenetic tags in very significant ways. If we're going to consider the field known as Nutri-Epigenomics, it actually explores on how food and epigenetics work together to influence the health and well-being of a specific individual. So if we're going to consider this, when it comes to the concept of epigenetics and diet, there are actually different types of compounds that are present on the food materials that we eat that can basically alter and change the different metal tags that are present on our body. If we're going to consider this, studies have shown that children born during the period of the Dutch famine from 1944 to 1945 have increased rates of coronary heart disease and obesity after maternal exposure to famine during early pregnancy compared to those who are not exposed to famine. So basically, the different epigenetic tags that were simply transmitted from the mother to the offspring can actually create now different types of conditions which can be inherited by the next generation, even the later generations. Okay? So if you're actually going to consider this, even the cheeseburger that you consumed probably 10 years ago can greatly affect the epigenome of your offspring or of the next generation. The fried chicken that you consumed earlier could be the reason for the emergence of different types of diseases that will be present on your body or on the body of your offspring. So basically, whenever we are talking about epigenetics, everything that is present in our environment can affect every single one of us. So now, since we considered here the relationship of the epigenetics and the environment and even our lifestyle, let's now consider here the application of epigenetics. Well, epigenetics is actually one of the best alternative when it comes to the concept of cancer therapy. So, how are we going to apply the concept of epigenetics when it comes to this particular case? Every single cell that is present in our body are containing the tumor suppressing gene. And this tumor suppressing gene, from the name itself, it actually suppresses the presence of cancerous growth when it comes to the cell, or the uncontrollable cell division of a certain type of cell. Since we already established that the environment is actually affecting our epigenetic markers, some of these epigenetic markers can actually be attracted to the cytosine that are actually present near to the tumor suppressor gene, or those epigenetic markers can create tighter coil between the tumor suppressor gene and the histone protein that is present near to it, technically silencing the tumor suppressor gene. If the tumor suppressor gene is silenced, obviously, it can no longer protect the cells from being cancerous. It cannot actually check now if the cell is properly dividing or not. Well, the concept of epigenetics is actually one of the best alternatives when it comes to cancer treatment, since majority of the different types of treatment and therapy when it comes to cancer are focusing on the destruction and death of those cells. There's actually a possibility that we can actually focus not on the cancer or on the mass, but rather we can target the different markers that are suppressing or silencing this certain type of gene. So basically, we should target the roots. We should target the genes. And when it comes to this particular case, if ever that in the near future, this will be very available, humans can now actually possess better understanding and better cancer therapy. And at the same time, this therapy can be utilized for other diseases and conditions just like asthma, diabetes, lupus, and Alzheimer's disease that are actually possessing the same concept, just like what is present when it comes to the presence of the epigenetic markers that are present near to that tumor suppressor gene that was simply silenced. So always remember that when it comes to the different epigenetic tags, even though this is still an emerging concept and idea when it comes to the scientific community, always remember that the different lifestyle choices that we are going to do nowadays can actually alter the different epigenetic tags that are present in our body, and it could lead to the progression of different types of diseases in our body. And at the same time, some of these epigenetic tags can stay on our genome and be passed down on the next generation. So before I end this discussion, let's consider first once again the debate between nature and nurture. Are you team nature, which is now the presence of the genome and the epigenome, or are you team nurture, which are now the different materials and things that can affect the genome and the epigenome on our nature, or is it the combination of two? Because if you're going to ask me, it is not only the nature, it is not only the nurture, but actually It is the epigenetics that possess a great influence when it comes to the growth, development, and at the same time, the presence of the different characteristics that could simply be passed on from one generation to the next. So at the end of this discussion, I would like to leave this short reminder for everyone. There are things that we can do now that can positively influence our epigenome. It is never too late. It is never too late to choose great. It is never too late to choose healthy living, proper lifestyle, and better choices when it comes to life. Because remember, it may not only affect you, but also affect the generations to come. Thank you for listening to this discussion and paalam.